Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's annual Technology Baseline 2020 Transportation Update. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to get logged in and get settled. So if you will just sit tightly, we will begin momentarily. Thank you. All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Once again, welcome everyone to NREL's annual Technology Baseline 2020 Transportation Update. My name is Jackie Petrie, and I am joined today by my colleagues at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the U.S. Department of Energy. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items with you all. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available in a few days on NREL's Learning YouTube channel. The presentation is also currently available at the web URL that you see on your screen. If you have any audio issues throughout today's presentation, we recommend that you try switching from computer to audio on your phone. You can do that under the audio section of the GoToWebinar interface, as you see on the right side of the screen. You can also message us through the questions panel in the GoToWebinar interface with audio issues, and we'll do our best to help you resolve those. If you have other questions throughout the presentation, please submit them using the questions panel in the GoToWebinar interface. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible, but feel free to submit those at any point during the presentation. With that, I'd like to hand things over to Laura Bimmerstedt of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to present the new Transportation Annual Technology Baseline, and I'd like to acknowledge the contributions from my colleagues and co-authors who are listed here, both at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and at Argonne National Laboratory, and there are also many others not listed here who have supported the development of this project. And without this team effort, we would not be here today. So I'll dive into the agenda. This is an overview of the agenda. First, I'll talk about why the ATB, what is the motivation for this project? And then I'll give an overview of the project, including its content and purpose. Then my colleague Paige Jaden will demonstrate the website, and finally we'll open things up for questions and comments. And please As Jackie mentioned, please do submit your questions and comments at any time. We'll try to work in the ones that are best answered during the presentation, and we'll also have plenty of time for questions and comments at the end. We have a 2-hour time block for this webinar, and we may finish early depending on how things go, but that should allow us plenty of time to dive into questions and comments. So turning to the motivation of this effort, why the ATB? Why did we develop this website and data set? So a number of years ago, analysts involved in scenario analysis noticed that pretty much any time we set out to do an analysis, the first step was to update all of the data about current technology, cost and performance, because the pace of technology development in the energy sector, particularly in the areas where DOE and the national labs are involved with research and development, is just a real rapid pace of change. So the reports on technology progress had a short shelf life, and for analysts, it can be a challenge to find current, credible, and consistent information all in one place that's suitable for a system-wide energy analysis. So it's our hope that the ATB will inform transportation sector analysis by providing this kind of cost and performance technology data, both within transportation, which is what we're talking about today, and also on the electricity side of things, which is another component of the ATB website. So now for a quick overview of the content and purposes of the ATB. The ATB is fundamentally a website and a set of summary data, providing cost and performance about selected vehicles and fuels. We do hope to extend the scope of the vehicles and fuels in future years. And from the ATB, we link to a wide variety of publicly available resources. So the ATB functions as something of a portal to kind of the latest, greatest reports and data sets from the DOE system. The ATB also provides a set of scenarios, high-level scenarios for potentially for energy systems analysis that are grounded in technology innovation and anticipated technology improvement. And the website and the data products that we have developed also, we hope, will provide a platform for your exploration, selection, and download of specific data to try to help you as users navigate quickly to the data and assumptions that you are interested in. So I think it's equally important to note several things that the ATB is not. So the ATB is not a primary analysis. We refer to primary sources and consolidate many of them, but this is not setting out to conduct primary analysis. It is also not a model, and it's not an all-encompassing set of future scenarios, though we do provide several. So this slide kind of provides an overview of the content of the ATB. Essentially, we're collecting a wide variety of input data about vehicle cost components, or vehicle component costs, rather, fuel and blend stock costs, and then compiling this into vehicle costs, fuel economy, well-to-tank emissions, and fuel costs, which are then used to calculate a levelized cost of driving and a well-to-wheels emissions metric with certain assumptions about discount rate, VMT, and vehicle lifetime. So I think it's important, though, to note here, in some efforts, the the outputs are really the main focus. In this data set, the inputs and outputs, I would say, are equally important, if not the things called inputs here, perhaps to some of you being more important than the calculated outputs. I think that's just important to note that the outputs are not the entire point. And we do pull this together from a wide variety of sources, which are on the next slide. So the primary sources of much of the data are listed here. There's many others that are listed line by line in one of the downloadable spreadsheets for the ATB. So we hope that that provides a strong framework for documentation so that you can track down data and understand exactly what it is that we're pulling together here. I note on the vehicle cost components and the vehicle costs and fuel economy, much of these are input assumptions from Argonne's autonomy modeling and also results from autonomy modeling. Excuse me, the fuel data often comes from techno-economic analysis reports that are conducted across the biofuels pathways by the National Lab System in support of DOE. The fuel emissions at a well-to-tank level come from Argonne's GREET model, and a variety of other major sources are noted here. Okay, so what value are we hoping to provide with the ATB? It's our hope that this will be a transparent, consistent, credible, and accessible source of data. We're consolidating, as I just mentioned, from a lot of different sources, with an emphasis on DOE's sustainable transportation analysis and the national labs that support that. And this is also for use within DOE and the national labs, as well as to publish those sources. We were aiming to summarize data at a high level for system-wide analysis. So while many of the resources that we refer to dive deep into specific components, this effort is targeting kind of translating that detail up to a higher level. And then we're really trying to have this be very organized to support users in exploring the interactive charts, selecting and downloading specific data, which is free and publicly available, and we hope easily accessible. And if, as you use the ATB, if we are falling short of these goals, we would really like to hear about it. The website does have a comment function. We really welcome and value your comments and hope that you'll let us know how we can improve. So the transportation ATB is joining an ATB for electricity that we have published for the past 6 years. And the electricity ATB has been used in model inputs that have supported a variety of analyses across DOE and national labs, as well as quite a number of external users listed here. So it's our hope that this new transportation ATB that we're discussing today will similarly support a variety of models, analyses, and users, and that you all will help provide feedback about how we can do that better. And of course, you know, the electricity ATB is out there. This webinar today focuses on transportation, but they're both out there and publicly available. So if you see things on the electricity side that you'd like to comment on, please do that as well. So to summarize, before we dive into the web demo, so the ATB provides a lot of assumptions that are targeted towards supporting energy systems analysis with the core ATB data of base and projected years for fuel economy, vehicle cost, fuel emissions, and then calculations based on financial assumptions and VMT to calculate levelized cost of driving and emissions per mile. This is delivered in a set of products. So we have the spreadsheet, which, as I mentioned, has detailed citations, the website, a Tableau workbook, formatted data sets, and presentation slides. So hopefully these products will be useful to you. And again, we welcome comments if they fall short of your needs. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Paige Jaden, to do a demonstration of the website. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Laura. So now I'll switch over to the website and use kind of the rest of our presentation time today to walk through the site, kind of highlight the technologies and the data that are included there, and to just overall illustrate the overall website functionality. So what I'm showing now is just the ATB homepage. As Laura mentioned, the ATB includes two primary sources of data. So we have the ATB electricity, which is data on electric generator technologies. And then today, we'll obviously be focusing on the other side, which is the newly added ATB for transportation. So to start this tour, I will jump to the technologies page of the ATB site. So the two main technology types in the ATB are the vehicles and the fuels. And this technologies page is really meant to give an overview of the types of data and the scenarios that are included for those different technologies. So for vehicles, as Laura mentioned, we provide data on fuel economy and vehicle cost, but then also on the levelized cost of driving and per mile emissions, which are also based on the assumed fuel for those vehicles. For the vehicles, we include three different scenarios, which are trajectories, and they're projected through the year 2050. So for the advanced scenario, or excuse me, advanced trajectory, we assume a certain level of technology breakthrough, we assume increased investment and other conditions that lead to improved vehicle cost, vehicle performance, or potentially both. And then in the mid-trajectory, we assume that technologies advance at more moderate levels, so just with continued industry growth and R&D that we see today. And then we also include a constant trajectory, and this assumes that technologies are held constant through 2050, so assuming no further advancements. And this scenario, as you'll kind of see in the charts, is used mostly as a reference to really understand how technologies might compare if they don't experience any further advancement. And it really does not imply that we think, that there aren't going to be any further improvements to cost or performance. It is used more as a reference. So again, for vehicles, we have three trajectories through 2050. For fuels, we provide different metrics, including fuel cost and fuel emissions at various different scenarios of technology progress and production volume. So, for example, we have current market scenario, and this is meant to reflect the observed prices in the market today. And then the other scenarios that you can see listed here are based on modeling, and they vary by technology assumption. So is it a current or a future type of technology? And then as well as the assumed production volume. So is it a current production, low, or high production volume? And these all have impacts on the resulting fuel metrics. So I'll note that these fuel scenarios differ from our vehicle scenarios in that they're estimates only for a fixed point in time. So we do not include trajectories for fuel for how we think they may advance going forward. So we have trajectories for vehicles, but just single point estimates for fuels. However, to get over this fact, we kind of include a range of different single point estimates for a variety of different scenarios, so you can kind of understand what the range of those technologies might look like. And then moving forward, because we do include this range of different fuel pathways and different fuel scenarios, we end up having a multitude of different fuels that are represented in the ATB. And as we'll see shortly when we kind of go on these pages, there's many to choose from. So for simplicity in some of our visualizations, we've down selected from these fuel pathways to just show a subset. So these kind of selected fuels include a baseline fuel, which is trying to be most representative of kind of what's available today. And then as well as selected fuels for each powertrain for the lowest cost fuel, as well as the lowest CO2e emissions, to give you an understanding of how this range of fuel impacts the levelized cost of driving and emissions. This table kind of shows those selected fuel pathways for each powertrain, but we'll dive a bit deeper as we go into the specific technology pages. And then also on this technology page, we have a little bit more information on how to interpret some of the key visualizations on the website. But again, I'll describe that in more detail when we actually get to those charts. Okay, so now we can actually start diving into the data and what is all in the ATB. So I'm going to start with the fuels technology. So the ATB includes estimates for a variety of different on-road fuels, as well as for jet fuels and marine fuel. So for on-road fuels on the left, within the left navigation, you can kind of see the range or the variety of fuels that we include in the ATB. So we have conventional fuels like gasoline and diesel, but also alternative fuels like multiple biofuel pathways, including ethanol, renewable diesel, and then as well as electricity and hydrogen. So to give an example of kind of what's all included on a fuels page, I'll start with ethanol. So for most fuels, we include data for a variety of different pathways and scenarios, and you can see those pathways and the associated scenarios listed on the top of the table. So for ethanol, for example, the pathways we include are cellulosic biochemical, cellulosic thermochemical, and then as well as starch ethanol. And then for this one specifically for biochemical, we also include two different scenarios. So we have a future modeled with low volume, and then as well as a future modeled with high volume. And so you can understand how that impact of production volume affects the fuel prices as well as other metrics. So besides, and so this is what we show for ethanol. I think as we get into the different fuel pathways, you'll see that we have different combinations of scenarios depending on kind of the availability of data and state of technology for those different pathways. So the metrics for fuel include things like fuel price, but where available, we also include the production plant operating characteristics. So for example, the fixed capital investment of the plant, fixed operating costs, variable cost, as well as other metrics. And then if you scroll down on where available, we also include the well to tank and well to wheels emissions for CO2e and different pollutants. And then as you keep scrolling down on each page, both fuels and technologies, at the bottom of the page, we also include the key assumptions that went into develop the estimates in the table above. So this helps to understand, what are the primary sources that we're pulling from, and to provide a little bit more context for the values that are shown in the tables and the charts. For each page, we also include links to definitions to get more information about some of these terms, as well as all of the links to all of the relevant references that are shown on this page. So all the fuels follow this kind of similar format, all the fuel pages, but I'll show a few other examples just to give an idea of the scope and some of the other fuels that we include in the ATB. So as another example, I'll jump to hydrogen. So again, the different pathways that we include and the different scenarios are listed across the top. So just as an example for hydrogen, steam methane reforming is kind of the incumbent technology for hydrogen production. On the far right, we have an estimate for the current market fuel price and other metrics for steam methane reforming, but we also have kind of a current modeled current volume estimate, and then is on the far left as well as a future modeled high volume estimate. So you can see how, as you get to more advanced technologies and how that impacts fuel price as well as other things. Specifically for hydrogen, the fuel price here should reflect the price at the pump. So this includes both the production cost of hydrogen, but as well as the delivery and the dispensing to get hydrogen to the stations. So advances across the different scenarios. So for example, going from current technology low volume to maybe a future technology with high volume reflects both improvements to the production technology, so steam methane reforming, for example, but also as well as on the technology for the hydrogen delivery. And those estimates are all included in the key assumptions for more detail. So hydrogen is a good example that for some of the fuels, the ATB includes many different pathways. So I don't know, over 10 here. So this can be a little bit overwhelming when we view all of these pathways on a chart. So as I mentioned previously, for use in some of our visualizations, as we see when we get to the vehicles page, we down select from these pathways to just show a subset to really illustrate the range of costs and emissions for all of these different pathways. So just an example for hydrogen, for the baseline fuel pathway, we use the current modeled steam methane reforming. And then for the lowest cost, you can see that that's $3.40 per GGE, and that's the future modeled high volume steam methane reforming. And then for the lowest emissions, that's actually the future modeled high volume low temperature electrolysis. So once we get to the vehicle charts, you'll see that those are kind of the three pathways that we can explore as we get to the levelized cost of driving in the emissions charts. We also have emissions, and then if you scroll all the way down, just like ethanol, we have all of those key assumptions, the references, more detail kind of that goes into how these values were developed. And then as one last example, I will show electricity. So again, we have multiple different pathways, and for electricity, the pathway primarily differs based on what the assumed grid mix is of the power sector, and then as well as different charging assumptions. So for example, we have current and future kind of national grid mixes, but then we also have grid mixes to reflect kind of a high renewable energy and a low renewable energy mix to see how that impacts emissions. And then we also have different plug-in electric vehicle or PEV charging assumptions. So kind of like our baseline PEV charging assumes a mix of at-home and public charging. You can see that for different grid mixes. But then we also include estimates for DC fast charging scenarios. So those have associated higher costs to get that higher charging or higher power charging. So you can see how the kind of fuel metrics change with these different assumptions. So kind of the charging going between PEV to DC fast charging has a big impact on fuel price. And then as well as switching between the different grid mixes really has a big impact on emissions. So for example, you can see the lowest emission pathway for electricity is this future high renewable energy penetration grid mix. Scrolling down, some key assumptions that are good to know about electricity. So we have all the other assumptions, but as well as kind of what we're assuming for the different charging behavior in our scenarios, how much is at home versus public versus workplace, as well as the different kind of assumed grid mixes for each of those pathways. So moving on from fuels, we can start moving over to the vehicle side. So I'll start with the light duty vehicle page. And again, as Laura mentioned, and I mentioned before, so the metrics we present here are fuel economy, vehicle cost, levelized cost of driving, emissions. And again, these are all estimated as trajectories through 2050. You can see on the left navigation here, all of the different powertrains that were included in this year's ATB. And currently we're just including light duty vehicles and specifically mid-size passenger cars. So all of these are for a mid-size light duty vehicle. So just to give an example of what's all included for a vehicle technology, I'll start with the fuel cell electric vehicle. For this current ATB, the fuel cell is modeled with a 320-mile electric range. So that just gives you an idea of how it compares to some of the other electric vehicles. And the first metric we show here is fuel economy. So for the vehicles, we have modeled the data as interactive charts. You can kind of hover and see the values. You can turn on and off different scenarios. And then we have some kind of filters and interactive selectors that I'll illustrate a little bit further down. But just specifically for fuel economy, you can see the different trajectories. So again, blue is that constant scenario, assumes no progress through 2050. And then you can see that in the mid is the orange and the advanced is the green. And these show, improved fuel economy that's driven by advances in things like the powertrain technologies, but then as well as lightweighting of the vehicle. So as you scroll further down, the next chart shows the vehicle cost. So again, the blue is just assumes no progress. That's just used as a kind of reference to compare the different states of the technologies. And then while the mid and the advanced scenarios show increasing levels of cost reductions. So for fuel cell vehicles, the cost reductions here are driven by advancements in component costs such as fuel cells as well as the hydrogen storage tanks. And then the cost reductions also reflect this decreased power requirement as a result of that increased fuel economy that we saw in the chart above. So since your vehicle is more efficient, maybe it's lighter, your fuel cell doesn't have to be as big to power that vehicle. So you have cost savings there as well. And then moving down, we'll zoom out, the levelized cost of driving, or LCOD as I call it, as we call it, charts are next. I think these charts are where it starts to get just a little bit more interesting, since now we're combining both data from the vehicles, but as well as data for the fuels as well. So this chart again shows the LCOD for, and in the current ATB, the LCOD represents both the cost to purchase a vehicle as well as the fuel cost. And then these costs are all levelized over the lifetime mileage of the vehicle to get kind of a per mile cost. I'll note that the LCOD shown here doesn't include other costs like operations or maintenance, and then it also doesn't include insurance or other incentives or tax credits. So we know that there are other drivers that could impact total cost, but here we're just focusing on the vehicle and the fuel currently. So this chart shows the LCOD trajectory on the top. And as I mentioned before, the vehicle cost and fuel economy are trajectories, but while the fuel price and the emissions are just single point estimates and they are held constant over time. So these trajectories really just reflect the improvements in the vehicle technologies, while the fuel estimates are held constant, and it's just showing fuel for one fuel pathway and one fuel scenario in these charts, in the trajectory. But the bottom of this chart starts to give you an idea of, this is the LCOD just given one fuel, but gives you an idea of the range of different fuel pathways that are included in the ATB. So this bottom chart here shows the range of fuel costs for all the different hydrogen pathways included. The black line represents what's the current pathway that's selected in this chart. So right now you can see we're selected on the baseline fuel, which again is kind of a current modeled SMR hydrogen. And the LCOD above reflects that price. So if you hover over the data, you can see what the selected or the currently it's the baseline fuel. And so that's at a hydrogen price of about $12 per GGE. But you can also see the other range of fuel costs included. So we have a maximum fuel cost pathway, which is the current market SMR, and that's $13.70. And then as well as the minimum cost fuel pathway, which is the future modeled SMR. So you can see the range of fuel costs, and then using the filter on the right, you can see what the impact is of changing between those different fuels and what the impact is on the LCOD. So for example, using the baseline, you can see the LCOD in 2050 in the advanced scenario is about 35 cents per mile. But then if we switch to the lowest cost fuel pathway, that decreases pretty substantially to now 26 cents per mile. And you can see on the bar chart on the bottom that now that black line where we are currently is on the bottom end of that fuel cost range. So if you scroll down, the CO2e emissions chart, so this is the well-to-wheel emissions and it's grams per mile. And this has a similar functionality. So you can see the emissions associated with that lowest cost fuel, but then you can also see how that changes is what if you select the lowest CO2e emissions fuel. Large decreases, and now you can again see that you're at the bottom of that range, and you can use this to explore the range of other pathways and emissions that are included here. Again, for the vehicles, just similar to the fuels, we have all of the key assumptions that are included for this technology, as well as the definition links and the references.
Hey, Paige,
Yeah.
While you're on this page, there's a question about the future scenarios for fuels and if they reflect estimates for 2050. Can you just give the example, sort of what that looks like here?
Yeah, so the fuels, we don't necessarily have a specific timestamp on them. Rather, they're estimates of technology advancement as well as production volume. So for example, if you choose a future scenario here, it's going to apply to all of the years. And the reason being is that we don't exactly know when that fuel is going to hit that level of technology progress or that level of technology volume, if that makes sense. So we don't have an associated year, we just apply that future, if it's a future pathway, for example, that's applied to kind of all of the years in this estimate, just to see how that type of advancement would affect LCOD or emissions. Laura, feel free to jump
I can comment a little bit on that as well. So folks who are familiar with the techno-economic assessments that are done for DOE's Bioenergy Technologies Office, those techno-economic analyses have the concept of an nth plant. So the idea is that that's the techno-economically feasible characteristic of a plant that could be achieved at sort of full market volume and technological maturity with the innovations that are described in those analytic reports. So it's separate from any particular time frame because of the uncertainty about that.
Is that okay, Kara? Were there any other questions?
That's it for right now.
Feel free to ask more too if that didn't wholly address your question. Okay, so I'll show one more example just of a different powertrain to see how some of these metrics might vary. So just I'm showing a battery electric vehicle with a 300-mile range here. And follows the same flow as the fuel cell. The vehicle pages kind of follow the same flow. So you can see the BEV kind of has similar trends of improvements in fuel economy over the different scenarios. And again, this is due to advances in the powertrain technology. So things like lighter batteries, increased motor efficiency, as well as lightweighting. And then for vehicle costs, we also see large decreases here. And again, this is primarily driven by reduction in the battery costs. But similar to the fuel cells, it's not just about cheaper batteries, but it also reflects the reductions in power requirements as the vehicles become more efficient. So your battery is cheaper, but you also don't need as large of a battery to get the same vehicle range. So you have cost savings there as well.
Can you can also to the documentation of those component level costs?
Yeah, so the component level costs are all included in the definition. So we have that in the, we include the definitions for the different vehicles, fuels, and scenarios. And for each of the powertrains, we've included the associated component level assumptions. So for example, in the BEVs, we have the assumed battery cost trajectories over time. And again, this is based on work from the Argonne team and the assumptions that go into their autonomy modeling. So you can see the battery costs here. And then while I'm here, just similarly for fuel cells, we include the assumed fuel cell cost trajectory as well as the hydrogen storage tank cost. So you can kind of review those assumptions here. Again, it's on the definitions page. So those component level assumptions were used in the autonomy modeling at Argonne, and then those Argonne results are what for the vehicle level costs and fuel economy are what we're showing on the ATV. Okay, so that was vehicle costs. Again, you can see the levelized cost of driving and see, kind of the impact that the different fuel pathways have on that. And then similarly for emissions, so I can show an example. This is showing kind of the baseline fuel pathway, but if you select the lowest CO2e emissions, you can see large decreases in emissions due to an assumed cleaner grid mix of that electricity. And then again, all of the key assumptions for that vehicle are listed here, so you can kind of dive into more of the detail. So for all of the technologies,
can you point out where we get the emissions assumptions?
The emissions assumptions associated with the electricity. So the emissions that we're showing here are, so the emissions that are shown here are the well-to-wheel emissions. So based on what the emissions of the electricity is. So as we went to, let me go back to it, the electricity page. The electricity page kind of has the fuel emissions assumptions for all of the different grid mixes. And for electricity, for most of the fuels, these emissions estimates are coming from GREET. Some are coming from, for some of the biofuels, are coming from specific analyses for those biofuels. But for electricity specifically, we have the different assumed grid mixes. We're using the GREET model from Argonne to then estimate what the associated emissions are for that electricity. And then going back to the BEV. So on the electricity page, it shows kind of the emissions per BTU or per energy unit for that fuel. And then the well-to-wheel emissions, that what's shown here, also incorporate the emissions of the fuel, but incorporate the efficiency of the vehicle as well. So you know how much emissions are associated with an energy of fuel, and then the fuel economy tells you how much fuel is needed to go per mile. So this well-to-wheel emissions incorporates kind of both of those aspects of the fuel and the vehicle. Is that what you're asking, Kara? Yep. Awesome. Okay. So again, where was I? Okay, so the pages here, you can explore each of those powertrains on their own. They have those similar charts, but we also include a comparison page so that you can start to view these powertrains side by side. So at the beginning of the comparison page, we include some important notes that we think it's good to consider kind of before comparing these different powertrains and saying which is more or less competitive. So these notes are that there are many different factors that go into a purchase decision of a vehicle, and some of these factors might not be directly tied to cost. So for example, you can think of things like refueling time and convenience. So being able to fuel your vehicle quickly, or maybe being able to fuel or charge your vehicle at home. And then as well as the availability of different makes and models. So maybe you want a specific powertrain, but it's not available in a small SUV, and that's the type of car that you want to get. And then as well as the introduction of new technologies like autonomous vehicles. So all of these different factors might make technologies more or less favorable from the perspective of a consumer. So it's important to consider these different attributes when looking at the comparisons of cost and LCOD, and then drawing conclusions about the competitiveness of different powertrains. Since it's not just cost, there's lots of other factors that go into buying one type of vehicle over another. So with that in mind, we can move to some of these comparison charts. So it follows the same flow as that. We start with fuel economy, but now you can see all of the different powertrains, or a variety of them, on one chart. And the filter on the right kind of allows you to select which ones you're interested in. So for example, and I can include a BEV 200 if I wanted to, and remove it just for simplicity. But you can kind of see the technologies that you're interested in and compare those. So for fuel economy, we kind of see similar trends in fuel economy for all the different vehicles. We have, a good level of improvement based on advancements in the vehicle technologies. But if we go to vehicle costs, things start to look just a little bit different. So you can see how the vehicle cost trajectories compare for all of the different powertrains. So for the ones that we were looking at before, fuel cells and batteries, we saw pretty large decreases in the cost due to kind of decreased component costs as well as other things. But if you look at some of the more established technologies like internal combustion engine vehicles and hybrids on the left, you don't see those strong decreases, and in some cases you even see maybe increases in cost. And this is due to the increased penetration of advanced engine technologies. So these advanced technologies are added to improve the fuel economy of the vehicles, but then they also come with higher costs as well. So you can kind of see cost increases there, but then we don't see that in the advanced powertrains, since those decreases in component costs, the more expensive parts of the car like batteries and fuel cells, those decreases outweigh the cost increases for those kind of higher efficiency technologies. Moving down, you can see the comparison of the levelized cost of driving. So you can compare kind of both the vehicles, the trajectory of the LCOD, and then with the panel on the bottom, you can also compare kind of the range of the different associated fuels and fuel pathways with those powertrains. So you can see how the cost of fuel on a dollars per GGE basis varies for all of the different fuel pathways. So this chart here shows the LCOD, just assuming that baseline fuel pathway for each of the powertrains. But you can see how kind of this comparison changes if, for example, we select the lowest cost fuel pathway for all of those vehicles. So if you select lowest cost, it looks a bit different. One example is that now the fuel cell becomes more cost competitive on an LCOD basis with some of the other technologies. So if you scroll down, there's this, again, the same functionality for emissions. You can choose the lowest CO2 emissions and see kind of how that changes the picture of per mile well-to-wheel emissions. So these are the trajectories. For specific use cases, we've also included kind of single year snapshot comparisons for all of these metrics. So just for example, this shows the fuel economy in 2020, just in 2020 for all of the different scenarios and powertrains. Since 2020, is right now, so they all should be similar. They're all on top of each other, but if you select a year in the future, you can see how those different scenarios spread and what the variation is of those assumed scenarios over time. So we also include single year comparisons for those metrics as well. So all the vehicles and the fuel technologies pages are really the key content for the ATB, but I want to end the demo just by mentioning a few other important pages on the site. One that we went to before, but is in the About section, we include definitions. So we have the definitions for the different technologies, the vehicles, the fuels, the scenarios, and then as well as the metrics. So for example, in the metrics, a good example is the levelized cost of driving. It gives the definition of that calculation. What are some of the assumptions, for example, on VMT, discount rate, what goes into developing that levelized cost of driving. So you can explore the definitions for the different metrics and technologies here. We also have a literature context page, which kind of puts these ATB assumptions into the context of recent literature and other estimates from other sources. The next page is data. So again, we intended for this site to be very easy to use, and so you can view the data easily. But we also provided the raw data in Excel downloads, so you kind of can explore the data and visualize it to fit your needs. And we've tried to structure the data in a database-friendly way, so it should be pretty easy to import into different programs. And the raw data, so where on the website, as we've seen, we just kind of include a subset of the fuel pathways for some of our visualizations. So the baseline, the lowest cost, the lowest emissions. The raw data also includes estimates for all of the different fuel pathways. You can see the LCOD and emissions for all of the range of the different fuel pathways that we include. The data download files also include more detailed kind of line level documentation for how the data was used from a reference. So for a specific row, for a specific reference, we include more information on if there were any calculations or manipulations involved to get at that specific data estimate. And then also on the data page, we've included an embedded Tableau workbook, which is not showing up. Okay, we've included an embedded Tableau workbook. So in case you don't want to download all of the raw data and create the visualizations on your own, we provided this so that you can explore kind of the full set of data. So for example, this shows the levelized cost of driving for the different powertrains. But if you scroll down, now you're allowed to select between all the different fuel pathways that are available, not just those three kind of baseline lowest cost, lowest emissions. So this allows you to explore that also without having to download and create your own visualizations. And then lastly, but definitely not last but not least, is the contact page. So again, we would greatly appreciate any feedback or suggestions you have on how to make this site better, especially, that this is kind of like our first year of the transportation ATB. We really want to make sure that it's meeting any of the needs that you had. So this could be things like different technologies to add or different metrics, other sources, references that we consider, or just basic, website structure, functionality, navigation. Any feedback you have would be very welcomed. So that's it for the web demo. I'll close with just a few remaining slides. So, I hope it was useful in giving an overview of the scope and the functionality of this website. We're really striving to make this a product that's credible, consistent, transparent, relevant, accessible, all those things that Laura mentioned. And we really want it to be a product that's useful to other analyses that are looking at these current and future transportation technologies. And again, I'll say it one more time, we welcome any comments, any feedback you have for how we can improve this site in coming years and coming releases. If you are interested, we have a link here on the site to sign up to receive email updates and announcements about the annual technology baseline, so please sign up there. And then lastly, I just want to give a huge thank you to our DOE sponsors, Kara at SPIA, as well as HFTO, VTO, BITO. All the people there have really helped to make this product better, and we really appreciate their support in getting this out into the world. So that's all I have, Kara. I'll hand it back to you if there's any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Paige. That was great. We do have a number of questions. I encourage everybody to keep putting them into the chat box, and we'll start ticking away at them. The first question, and I think we answered this in the chat box, but I think it's also worth just speaking to directly, is expansion onto medium and heavy duty platforms or vehicles. And I'm happy to say that those are things that we're considering. This is really the first year we're trying to get this set of data out, and it's a lot of stuff, a lot of information as a starting point. And so we're definitely looking for feedback to consider as we look to build this going forward. Maybe Paige or Laura, do you want to speak to what low volume versus nth plant assumptions mean, and how they apply both for fuels as well as vehicles?
Yeah, so when we describe low volume scenarios, we're talking about low volumes of implementation of that technology, as opposed to, for example, in a biorefinery, a low volume of throughput or daily production. And so with the same principle applies both to fuels and vehicles. So with vehicles, low volume would refer to a low volume of production of those vehicles. Paige, do you want to comment on that further?
Yeah, I'll say one thing about vehicles. So for all of the powertrains in the ATV except for the fuel cell, we assume that they're already at a high level of production. So that's somewhere around 200,000 vehicles produced per year. So all of those are already assumed at a high production level. Specifically for the fuel cells, we assume that currently it's at a little bit of a lower level of production, but we assume that production ramps up to eventually meet higher full production volumes kind of in the midterm. That's helpful.
Excuse me. There's another question about recent announcements by vehicle companies on the cost of their vehicles, and how do those numbers compare to what we show here in the ATB?
I can take that, and Laura, feel free to add more. So I think comparing the costs here to costs on the market isn't super straightforward, and I think there's a couple components to that. So one is here we're really trying to model a representative vehicle, and a representative vehicle that's comparable across all of the different powertrains. So in the autonomy modeling, they kind of start with a base vehicle, and then technology packages and the different advancements are added similarly to all of these different powertrains over time, so that you can get a better comparison of, all right, what's this level of progress of an internal combustion engine vehicle versus a battery electric vehicle, for example. Because of this consistency and because it's a representative vehicle, it's not necessarily going to line up with the variety of different makes and models that are available on the market today. So for example, if you compared the fuel cell vehicle that we're modeling here to maybe one of the limited fuel cell vehicles that's available on the market, like the Mirai, it's not necessarily the same vehicle. So it could be a little bit of a different size, a different size or weight. The vehicle on the market could have different technology packages, different trims, different components that vary from what we see here. So they're not directly comparable for some of these reasons. And then another thing that makes it a little bit tricky is that we're not exactly sure what the pricing schemes or the pricing mechanisms are for some of these manufacturers. So there's data to suggest that some vehicles, especially advanced powertrains, could be selling at a loss, whereas we can't really reflect that here. We're reflecting the vehicle cost from a manufacturer perspective. So how much does it cost to manufacture the vehicle, and then as well as an assumed kind of profit margin that they would sell that vehicle for. Whereas what's on the market today is a little bit more fluid. Laura, feel free to add anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the most tricky things about this data, but Paige, I think you did a great job explaining the importance of seeing this data as a kind of a standardized set of vehicles that is a little bit abstracted from what's actually out there in the marketplace with all of its idiosyncrasies.
Thanks. There's another question about sort of what does the constant case represent, and how might folks use that in future projections?
Yeah, this is Laura. I can take that. So, there's sort of a question of what should be, in a sense, the pessimistic case. So rather than developing sort of a fully realized pessimistic case, we have the constant in there as a default. That's something that's definitely unpopular with a number of folks who have reviewed and commented on the development of this, but I think it was just a challenge for us to come up with a basis for something that represented a pessimistic case. The constant case is in some sense an artificial lower bound, and in scenario analysis, on occasion there's a use for some sort of like lower bound like that. I guess to the point that sort of any future case will be better than today. I think that there is, for a mature technology, certainly there's some variability in both directions in costs, and there's also choices around paying more for increased performance and such. So, it's even though it may seem unlikely, there are some possibilities that costs could go up in the future. So I would, maybe invite users to use that as they will, and certainly feel free to ignore it if that's not something that's useful to you. And Kara, did you want to comment further on that? I know we've had a lot of discussions about what to include.
No, I think that was a great description, and it's just to sort of give a bound of what is possible and have a wider range of scenarios that analysts can use. So certainly feedback on that is useful as well. We have a question on fuels. So for electricity and hydrogen, it seems like a range of upstream emissions or assumptions are available. Why are we not doing that for some of the liquid fuels and biofuels in particular?
Yeah, so I think that's something that we received feedback on as well, and encouragement to consider that for future development. That was something that we did not have available at this time to offer. It would be a little bit more involved to come up with that than it was to pull the various upstream data for electricity and hydrogen. So that's an important area, and one, I guess, with biofuels as well, though, that there are some opportunities to see a range of values across the different biofuels that are listed. So although you might want more of a range of upstream assumptions, like say with variation in feedstock assumptions, things like that, there is some range available in the existing data, and we hope to increase that.
Great. We have another question on what is a light-duty vehicle, or at least how do we use it here in the ATB?
So for us currently, a light-duty vehicle, we're constraining ourselves here to passenger light-duty vehicles, so things that are used for passenger travel. And we, in this current version of the ATB, we're only considering mid-size vehicles, so things like sedans. I think there's opportunity to increase that to include other different size classes like SUVs, pickup trucks, etc. But for now, we're just sticking to light-duty passenger vehicles. And when we say passenger, all of the assumptions, like, for example, on levelized cost of driving and the operation of those vehicles are based on average consumer behavior for how much a passenger drives their vehicle in a year and over the lifetime of the vehicle.
Great. We have a question about charger costs, and maybe you can show sort of how we've integrated that into the ATB.
Yeah, I can show that one. I gotta remember. Yeah, let me find where it is. So let me get some here. So we're including charger costs for plug-in electric vehicles and battery electric vehicles, and it's incorporated in the levelized cost of driving. So essentially, we add the capital cost of the charger as well as the installation cost of the charger on top of the vehicle cost to calculate the levelized cost of driving. What I'm showing here kind of shows the assumptions that we used, and these are based on recent analysis from some colleagues at NREL that were essentially trying to quantify or get a levelized cost of electricity across various scenarios. So what we've done is for PHEVs, so plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and then battery electric vehicles, we use their assumptions on the share of both level 1 and level 2 charging that those vehicles use. So for example, for plug-in hybrids, we assume 50% level 1, 50% level 2. But then for battery electric vehicles, we assume it's a smaller share of level 1 since they need higher power charging. So 16% level 1 and 84% level 2. And then using those ratios, we can calculate kind of what the equipment and installation costs are. And these are the costs that we assume for level 1 and level 2 charging. So level 1, it's kind of assumed that that's available at home. So it's a negligible cost, while the level 2 charger has about $1,800. So use those charger ratios to get the kind of total charger cost for each battery electric vehicle, and then factor that into the levelized cost of driving. While I'm here too, so this is for the specific chargers. We also have assumptions for how people charge to calculate the electricity cost. So that includes things like what is the share. So what I just showed is kind of like your at-home charging scheme. But we also have assumptions on, how much people, this is on the electricity page, how much people charge at home, which is a large share of the charging, how much is workplace, which is at a commercial level 2, and then how much is public. And again, this is based on that same analysis, this Borlaug et al. 2020. And for right now, we're just assuming these fixed charger costs. I think we're interested and looking for data on like projections for these costs, but currently we just kind of have a fixed cost estimate kind of reflecting what's today. But I think if available, we'd like to add trajectories for how these might change or decrease in the future.
Paige, there's a follow-up question on charging infrastructure. So does the charging infrastructure include things like increased transmission and distribution and non-home chargers, and sort of what's the parallel on the hydrogen side?
So for electricity, we're not including that directly. It's baked in a bit, I guess, to the electricity prices. So we include some future modeled, but this is kind of more at the bulk power system level, some future modeled grid mixes. So the future national grid mix, for example, is from AEO, while the other 2 future mixes are from the standard scenarios. So we kind of take the wholesale to bulk power prices from those scenarios, but to the extent on the impact on the distribution level costs, we're not factoring those in directly here, though we note that that could be, higher levels of charging could come with large increases in costs, based on distribution upgrades, but we're not directly quantifying them. For hydrogen, the distribution costs are kind of baked into the hydrogen price that we show here. So the kind of fuel price is meant to reflect the price at the pump. And I think we believe we have a bullet here that kind of details what the specific delivery and dispensing cost portion of those costs are for the different scenarios, and they kind of vary on the delivery and dispensing technology assumed and kind of the volume estimates. So you kind of explore those here on the hydrogen page.
Maybe while we're talking,
go for it.
Oh, sorry, Kara. I was just thinking maybe as long as we're talking about hydrogen, it might be good to address the question about hydrogen internal combustion engine vehicles. Neha, did you want to address that question?
Sure. There's a question around whether we're modeling whether we're modeling hydrogen combustion engines or solely hydrogen fuel cells. So in general, this website has been populated with data from the DOE offices, baselining the current status of technologies being funded by DOE and feasible costs in the future if DOE targets are met. So combustion engines have not been a focus of the Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technologies Office's research for a while now, not in the transportation sector, and are also not being substantially deployed by OEMs in the transportation space. So right now, there's not a plan to include combustion engines for this transportation ATV. There is some interest in hydrogen engines for like power generation. So to the extent that that becomes a bigger part of the portfolio, it's feasible that maybe in other versions of the ATV someday, that technology could be included. But in the transportation sector, since it's not being funded for transportation applications, it's not a part of the platform.
And I guess maybe as long as we're talking about internal combustion engine vehicles, there was also a question as to the rationale why the vehicle costs for those vehicles increased. And if any of my colleagues from Argonne would like to add to the answer that I'm going to give, please raise your hand to be recognized. But essentially, with internal combustion engine vehicles, there's the possibility that they would adopt more advanced technologies, such as lightweighting, such as engine technologies, that would increase performance but also increase costs. So those increasing costs in certain of the long-term scenarios would reflect those kinds of expectations.
And yeah, one thing just to add too is you actually, in the ICEV costs, you actually see it kind of go up and then go back down. And this is kind of the balance of you're adding these these technologies to improve fuel economy, but as a result, you actually need a less powerful engine. So, you are adding these technologies, but because the vehicle is becoming so much more efficient, you don't need as large of an engine, so you save on costs as well. So that's kind of why you see that non-monotonic behavior of the kind of costs going up, and then as the vehicle requirements get reduced, then you kind of see them go back down.
There was also a question about market penetration and competition among the technologies, and what market shares of vehicles might be expected over time. So the ATB is not projecting market shares of future vehicles. We are providing data that has been and can be used in those sorts of modeling exercises. But apart from designating low volume production versus high volume production, we're not running a consumer choice or manufacturer's choice model to estimate market shares of the vehicles. So hopefully that answers the question.
Do folks have any additional questions? Please keep populating in the chat box. We've addressed most of what's come in. Laura, can you maybe speak to the frequency of updates for the ATB again? How frequently the transportation one is anticipated to be updated, and generally how frequently the electricity one is updated?
Yeah, so historically we've provided annual updates, and it's even embedded in the name of the product, the annual technology baseline. So I think that going forward, part of that was driven by the frequent need for updates with rapid changes in the assumptions. I think going forward, there's some thinking on the electricity side that we may have certain years that are major updates and certain years that are minor updates. And with our data infrastructure that we have developed that's more sophisticated than in our early years, we do have kind of more flexibility to perhaps have interim updates, different categories of updates, and handle those in more complex ways with the database. But essentially, our intent is to continue an annual update cycle at this time. But that just depends on the evolution of the needs and the data platform, and other considerations. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think we have covered most of the questions that have been posed. So at this time, unless there's anything urgent from anyone else, I will thank everyone for participating.
Laura, can I jump in real quick? There's a few more questions that came up that are pretty specific, but I think if we have time, we can answer them quickly or attempt to.
Oh, sure.
There was one question, are the hybrid vehicles a combination of a full hybrid and a 48 volt, I presume? And what is the ratio between them?
That is something I do not know the answer to. If anyone from the Argonne team is available to answer, raise your hand and we can pass it to you. If not, I can get that information and answer it in this chat if that's still available.
Great, thanks.
But yeah, I don't know that answer off the top of my head. Yep.
So you know most of this, so it is quite impressive. There's a lot of data here. There's another question on changes in battery chemistry or fuel cell type. Have we captured sort of that level of detail here, or are all the BEVs all assumed to be lithium-ion batteries and the fuel cells all PEM?
Neha, I'll let you answer the fuel cell, but I do believe that we're assuming consistent battery chemistry. So I believe we're assuming kind of the standard lithium-ion battery for fuel cells over time, and for batteries. And I believe the same is for fuel cell, but Neha, correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure. So for current technology, the fuel cell vehicle is based on a PEM fuel cell, and like Paige said, the battery is based on a lithium-ion battery. For advanced case where we're showing R&D progress by 2050, that's driven by DOE's R&D targets. So that while the main fuel cell technology being studied today for transportation is a PEM chemistry for BEVs, obviously it's a lithium-ion. Those chemistries could evolve over time. So it's not a projection of like PEM fuel cell costs going down over time. It's DOE's R&D target being met, however that's met, whether it's with PEM fuel cells or alkaline or some other technology that evolves by the 2050 timeframe. But yeah, current technology is PEM and lithium-ion.
All right, I think those are most of the questions that we had. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds great. I guess if the hybrid vehicle question is about plug-in hybrids, those are provided separately. So we do have both hybrid and plug-in hybrid drivetrains. In any case, at this time, I'd like to direct everyone to submit future questions that you may have to the atb.nrel.gov comment page that's available on the website, and please don't hesitate to let us know any comments or questions via that portal. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today. Lots of great questions, and we hope that this has been helpful. And please do let us know if there are ways that we can help your work in the future with future iterations of the ATB, or if you have questions about the current version and where things are, what they mean. Any question is fair game. Please let us know. And thank you, everyone, and thank you all of the participants, co-authors, and everyone who helped to make ATB possible. So with that, I'll conclude, and everyone have a great day. Bye.
Thank you so much.